I largely agree with most of the points that Maria has made. I found them in our work in Real to be practical, and so most of what I have to say is to add to and fill in some of what Maria has presented. And so I'd like to sort of follow vaguely her structure of her presentation or her paper. I think the first point was she talked about the challenge, and I think I agree with the challenges, but I think one of the challenges that we face is an ecosystemic one, and I think this concept of the ecosystem is something that is for me a meta issue involving everything around finance and policy and institutions. If we imagine that on the one hand we have finance institutions, so this is the problem that we've sort of been facing. We as an organization worked with slum dweller movements for 20 odd years, very much employing community-led approaches, and I think that those have very significant merits and are policies that need to be, or approaches that need to be followed. But if you talked about a situation of, at the one end, a financier looking for who to finance, I think that Femi made this point earlier. Who do you finance? And who's actually capable of being financed? Who is credit worthy enough? Who's actually has sufficient managerial systems, etc., to be financed? And on the other hand of this ecosystem, a person entering the city looking for where they're going to be, where they can actually find housing. The general answer to that at the moment, and it seems even from some of the previous presentations, is, well, you go find yourself a place in a slum, because that's where you're going to have to live for 10 to 15 years until someone finds a solution for you. So between these two, there's this complex thing, and earlier on someone was giving a quotation, but for me, there's one of the first attorney generals in the United States was Oliver Wendell Holmes, and he's had this famous quote called, I don't give a fig for simplicity this side of complexity, but I'll give everything for simplicity the other side of complexity. And I think that in dealing with, and our work is mainly with trying to work with institutions that are trying to deal with this complexity. And there's a lot of piecemeal approaches to this complexity. And people want the simple solutions, whether it be titling or microfinance or some little component, and don't really want to deal with it as a whole. So we found, and I think Graham this morning talked about a number of the components. I can't remember if I've got them all right, but there's a whole range of ingredients, a whole range of components to putting together housing. It is a nexus of things. And it's about land, it's about finance, about construction materials, it's about the developer, it's about regulations, it's about people who represent groups of people. In developed world, it would be a realtor or an estate agent. That's where the developer would find the people who are going to buy the units. In our instance, it's community groups that sometimes number in the thousands. So unless all these people are working together in a very coherent way, in a way in which the value chains and each one's role in the value chain has been well established, it's very difficult to actually end up in a house. And a house that has rights, and a house that you can use the underlying title as mortgage or whatever it may be. And each one of these entities is separately financed. They all have to find their own money to do their thing. So unless each one of those actually has some form of credit rating or some form of being funding, then essentially you've got some elements along the chain that aren't funded and have to find their funding. So using the analogy of an orchestra, I often kind of refer to housing, particularly because I'm working in an environment where it's very difficult to explain to people sometimes how complex housing can be, particularly particularly in audiences where this sort of all happens behind the scenes and you don't really know, like in the UK. Someone else is dealing with it. There's a whole ecosystem of legal people, an ecosystem of financing people, and they sort of get everything done behind the scenes. When we're working with organizations, those are all the things we've got to do. And it's like an orchestra. It's like music. It's like putting music together, but orchestral music. You know, there's a whole range of players, and they each need to know their instrument pretty well. And if one of them doesn't know their instrument very well, it doesn't sound like, it sounds like noise. If you don't have sheet music, so if there's no strategy or no set of arrangements where these people actually know what their roles are, it also produces noise. I think Nairobi must be one of the noisiest cities in the world in that regard. Because when you start talking about INGOs and NGOs and CBOs and multilaterals and government and every other kind of consultant in the world all telling you what you should be doing, it's a bit like 500 conductors and no sheet music. And so it also, not just the funding of these, I think a point was made by you earlier this morning, was just the capacity of each of those players. They all need to know to play their role well. And when you're thinking that the ultimate is to try and produce affordable housing, well, then you need to know your instrument, if using a music analogy, even better, because we can't afford for wastage. We can't afford wasted time. We can't waste wasted money. And the problem is we tend not to have the best musicians and best players in our game. We've got people who were social workers who are trying to do infrastructure. We've got people who finance who are trying to do built environment work. It's a real clumsy affair. And I feel that this is the complexity that we don't want to deal with. And obviously, in terms of the agenda, there is obviously a directive for UN Habitat, because I think that there's a need to understand that these institutional arrangements are very important. This ecosystem, and it changes from city to city. You know, in some countries we have subsidies, in other countries we have none. In some countries you have free land, in some countries you have none. In some countries people have an economy. In fact, the slum is almost an export processing zone. It's not a slum at all. No one wants to leave it because you don't pay tax inside of it. In some cases they're places of despair. So the idea that you can have this sort of policy that somehow transcends national cities, even within countries and boundaries, is to be quite naive. And so when we're just trying to seek the universal in a policy approach to finance, I think that firstly that's what we run into. And to the large point, we kind of tend to ignore a lot of what comes down the wire and what is on the web pages of most of the multilaterals, because it doesn't really work. It worked in that country, it doesn't work in this one. And a lot of the things we've done are not bad. They're just, Chile and Brazil and South Africa are not bad, but there's a caveat to them. And what's happening in China is also fantastic, but then there's the economy. We're all buying Chinese products. Britain could afford its welfare system when we were all buying British, but we're not doing that anymore. So, it's looking at, I think for me, it's this appreciation of the complexity of, and we tend to look at this through the lens of finance, or through the lens of community-led, or through the lens of technology, in terms of industrialization, through the lens of rights, or whatever it might be. But what we need to do is really have a real understanding of all these components. So the other point I wanted to make about the finance and is really about gas stations. Finance is like car needs gas, and so finance for me is like gas stations. Petrol stations. It doesn't build the car; it just puts fuel in it, and essentially it's just fuel. It's important because if you want an efficient vehicle, you need to know how to consume less of it. But essentially the vehicle and the manufacture of the vehicle and where the vehicle is going, whether the vehicle is going to ride on, and forgive me about all my metaphors, I'm African. Is the vehicle going on tar road? Is the vehicle going on rough road? Is the vehicle going to go through swamps? Your vehicle that you're designing in your country needs to be able to adapt to different terrain. So there again, it's not the same vehicle. So the idea that finance is going to shape the vehicle, well, it might shape efficiency, but it's not going to shape the vehicle. And I think that, so that's its limitation. But but is it important? Here it is. I just the other point I wanted to make is we're focusing a lot on sort of the finance markets, but I think that we leave out the land market, and I think that in a way what we're dealing with here is not a finance market or establishing a new finance. It's actually a housing market, and it's actually a new housing market. It's a housing market that actually doesn't have ecosystems. There is no sector in these countries. Talking to Femi earlier on and over lunch, you know, there isn't a market there. There aren't lawyers who understand how to work in the sector. And just like with microfinance, the only difference is, you know, you don't have kind of the data you can get from Visa about whether someone's got an A income or a B income and where they go on holiday and all that kind of data. Essentially, you know, microfinance is essentially moving back to the old system of banking where the bank manager needed another client and has to go and understand their vulnerabilities. Well, the same thing in our sector is that this housing market is not understood by people. They understand it either through their own lens, but they don't understand that it has a set of common variables, but those change in every country. And so creating sheet music in each country is going to require some sort of finesse, some sort of creativity at the orchestra or, you know, music making or conducting level. And the role of conductor should always really be the local government. But often the local government, most that I encounter, don't even actually understand most of the musicians, and certainly don't know how to conduct, and some of them can't even read sheet music, again, using the analogy. So, in this market, understanding the market, you know, it's just important for us to really get to understand it. So there's obviously a data and a research, as long as it is context specific. I think there's a lot of opportunity for policy writing, you know, in terms of UNAPADAP's role, but I think that I would rather use precedent than policy. I think precedent is a much more powerful shaper of policy than policy based on theory and based on averages of averages of averages. So, and I think what we use in our work is really piecemeal. We take pieces out of different and develop hybrids in places. And so I don't know how you can create policies at a national level or policies at an international level that this is what you should do. There's been a lot of copying and pasting, and that is possibly why many countries have actually gone wrong. They just copied the policies of the country next door, or they've copied them from UN guidelines or whatever it might be. And I think it really needs a fundamental understanding of the complexity of putting housing together in different places. Going back to Maria's presentation, I think that housing finance is important. I would add to the kind of finance that you have up there, land financing. I think that in many countries, land is not made available by, sometimes it's not owned by the city, and it's not even owned by, sometimes we don't know who owns it, but it needs to be purchased. So a project doesn't get started if you don't get the land and you don't have the money to get the rights or to plan it. Micro-mortgages, as just not to say, I want to have a question to ask you later on, Maria, about the limits of mortgages, but we've introduced a mortgage product which is essentially called a mortgage because it has the underlying, it is secured by the underlying asset, so not as a title but as a land mass. And then equity. A lot of the institutions that are trying to do, you know, if you're talking about rental housing, you're looking at cash flows over many, many years, you know, you need long-term financing, and there's not a lot of that. So there is a need for short, medium, and long-term financing. There was another point I felt that you probably didn't have time to talk to. The role of government, I agree that, I mean, there's only one government and there's a lot of other actors, but I would hope that government doesn't try to be those actors. It frightens me when I look at one of the purposes, or at least the purposes of this agenda, is that government might get involved again, trying to be the developer again. I think that public-private misses out on a very important entity, and I'll probably talk about that tomorrow when we have the third or fourth session. But it's the idea that we need companies that perhaps are not private or public they serve a public good, but they're not government. They exist in perpetuity. In the UK, we have Peabody, Guinness. These have existed for 100, 150 years. And what they do is, instead of actually there being a shareholder and the original subsidy leaking out, it actually is retained in the institution, and they can exist in perpetuity. And I think that's very important, that public-private partnerships misses out a different hybrid. The other part is I wanted to talk about was when we do subsidize and when government does subsidize, who does it subsidize? I agree with Maria that you don't subsidize interest rates. I don't even think you subsidize people. I don't think you should subsidize the private sector. I do think you should subsidize an institution that will capture that subsidy in perpetuity. And I think that's just reinforcing the point I've just made. Thank you.